you see the agenda here. So what we did is really do our best to make this as interactive as possible. So we'll use two tools for that. One is Mentimeter and the other is Jamboard, which the workshop host will explain to you once we get to that. And then we've divided the workshop in three parts. The first part is what is fiscal policy? So Thomas will introduce you to the basics of fiscal policy. What is government spending? What role does taxation play in this? Then the second part is about why fiscal policy, which I think is really the crucial part here, because most of you will be, not working on fiscal policy if you're decided to attend this workshop, but you might work on climate change, on inequalities, on making the welfare system work better for citizens. And we'll explain, how does this all link and why is fiscal policy relevant for all these areas. And then in the third part, we'll move on to the EU fiscal framework. So as you might know, it's the EU economic governance framework is under review, and the European Commission is about to launch a consultation on this. And we'll talk about how do we get here, where we're at, and importantly also where do we want to go from here. And this will then be followed by a question and answer session where you can ask the hosts any questions you might have. And after that, we'll have an interactive discussion, in particular also on how you can get involved in this. So that's it from my side. I hope you're going to enjoy the workshop, and I'm going to hand over to Thomas for the first part. Thank you.
Thanks, Jan. Very happy to be here with all of you. I hope I can pass the slides and speak at the same time. If that's okay with you, we tried starting this with a bit of an interactive discussion, as interactive as we can be with many people on the Zoom call. But we'd like to know a bit about you and what your expectations are and how we can adapt to that today. So if that's okay with you, we're going to go through this tool here called Menti. And if you have a second device, for example, a smartphone or something like that, I think it could be better if you join us on this Menti board through that. And we'll be asking you what topics you're working on so that we can have a better overview altogether of who we're talking to. So happy to see you on Menti. Do tell me if this is working. I hope it does. And so there's two ways of doing it. Either you go on menti.com and enter this little code here that should show you a slide, or you can use the QR code there. Menti working. Great. Let's give it another 10 seconds. And here we are. So welcome to this workshop. Now that's good. And if everything's working correctly, you should be able to tell us what topics you're working on, and all this should be appearing here. We put a few examples. It can be climate, biodiversity, maybe you work for a union, maybe you're an economist, or you're working in the youth sector, education, gender, social. Well, that were my ideas, but you'll probably have tons of other stuff to tell us. Well, it's great to see that this is working. Okay, so we have a lot of climate, unsurprisingly, but that's great. Great. If you still want to contribute, wonderful. Well, this is a beautiful word cloud. it's good because we're going to do another one later. So I'm happy to see that this is working and that you can engage with it easily. I see a lot of climate, a lot of social inclusion or just inclusion, and social climate and youth, sustainability, and housing as well. And I think that's absolutely great because those topics are very, very close to the topic of fiscal policy. And I hope that we can show that and link it together during this workshop. Federico, I'm going to go back to the slides now. I know you wanted to screenshot this. I hope you
Great.
have. Okay, great. Let's go back to our slides then. So thanks for taking the time to tell us who you are. I'm Thomas. I work at the European Youth Forum as a policy officer. I work on fiscal policy. So very happy to tell you what fiscal policy is. We have this time from 4 to 4:10 that we planned for questions and answers, but please do feel free to put your questions in the chat if there is a need and if you're not following up. And excuse me, we're going to make another word cloud at the end of this session on what fiscal policy is and why it is important. So if you have a moment, write down the important concepts for you and see what's most important to you so that we can then share that and it will feed into our interactive discussion in the end. Okay, all good. So let's get into it. What is fiscal policy? There's two ways of defining it, but basically what fiscal policy is that it's one of the two arms of government policy when it comes to managing economic affairs. There's fiscal policy on one side and monetary policy on the other. And we're mostly going to be talking about fiscal policy here because this week of debate is about fiscal matters. I just wanted to flag that monetary policy will usually come into the discussions because it's very intertwined with fiscal policy. So that's mostly what the central bank does, the European Central Bank in our case, so interest rates and managing the money supply. But what we're going to be focusing on is fiscal policy. So that's the three legs, if I may, of fiscal policy are government spending, and where governments get their money to spend. And they do that in two ways. They can borrow or they can tax. So that's the whole fiscal policy. That's what it is. I think it's always important to go back to this because in Latin languages, I think that fiscal has another meaning. It means more only the taxation part. But here we're going to be talking about spending, borrowing, and taxing. Okay, so what is government economic policy? What is government policy? What do governments do? Well, they have quite a few things on their plates, and they have to manage welfare, they have to manage climate action, inflation, inequalities, unemployment, pensions, public services, education, healthcare, research. Those are just ideas, but it's mostly the good stuff. If when governments are working on this, then that's when fiscal policy is involved. So I just wanted to flag that, of course, so we have this model that looks quite simple. Of course, there are tons of relations between interest rates and borrowing, between spending and the money supply, etc. But that's a bit I'd say overboard for what we want to do today. Just so you have this general idea, and we're going to try to define and explain all the concepts that you might need to follow the rest of this week of debate or to engage in fiscal policy discussions in the future. So I was talking about government spending, and I had these examples, right? Welfare, healthcare, education, etc. And I wanted to show that if when you look at government spending in the EU 27, in I think these figures are about 2019, um, this is exactly what you see. Governments spend money on social protection, health, public services, education, and that's the big part of what they spend money on. I'd like to flag that when you look at this, these figures today, environmental protection is a very small part of what governments are spending their money on, and we know that this figure will have to go up in the future, and that's also why this fiscal policy debate is opening right now. So that's for the spending. Then the question is, who will pay for it? It's a question we usually get, and it's a very important one. So most of the spending comes from taxation, and these are figures for the EU 27. Basically, 80% of the taxation, and so of the government spending money comes from taxes on consumption and on labor, and then there's a 20% of that comes from capital. I promise this is the most difficult graph that I will show you today. So that was what is fiscal policy: spending, borrowing, taxing. I want to go into details on why fiscal policy is used and what are the different views on it today. So this person here is John Maynard Keynes. He was an economist, a very important one, and he defined what we called Keynesian economics now. In Keynesian economics, economic recessions, so crisis, downfalls, like what happened in 2008, for instance, are due to a deficiency in demand, right? So economics is all about supply and demand. And John Maynard Keynes wanted to take a look at this demand thing. And he realized that when he was an economist during the Great Depression that started in 1929, and he realized that the big downturn was linked to this aggregate demand number that he invented going down because consumption and investment were going down. So it's actually pretty intuitive. When there's an economic crisis, people consume less, companies invest less because they are afraid of what the future might hold, because, well, they're out of their jobs, so they don't have the actual purchasing power to consume or to invest. And so that's what Keynes saw and said, we have an economic recession because our consumption is going down and our investment is going down. So what he proposed, and was followed actually very soon in the United States, that's what the New Deal is about, was to say this aggregate demand thing is going down because of consumption and investment going down. Okay, so let's have government spending go up to compensate. So if people are not in a situation to consume, if companies are not in a situation to invest, then there's a lack of demand in the economy. So the government should start spending to either, reduce taxes or give money to the people or invest directly in building, I don't know, highways or stuff like that to actually create that demand and create the demand that will get the business and the economy going again. That's what we do. It's what we've been doing since then for in situations of economic recession. It's usually called recovery plans. So what you have two different legs to this. The government starts spending to support workers who are out of a job, to support families who have a reduced purchasing power. So that's what we saw during the coronavirus crisis as well. And then you also have a recovery plan, so a big investment plan to get the economy starting and rolling again. So that's the business cycle. I wanted to tell you something that's very important in Keynesian economics and that you might come across in these discussions during this week of debate, or if you're talking about fiscal policy later. It's called the fiscal multiplier, or sometimes it's called the Keynesian multiplier, since still because of John Maynard Keynes. So as I was saying, in our aggregate demand issue, where we have the consumption going down, the investment going down, so the government starts spending more. And what was discovered, notably during the New Deal, and has been confirmed again and again since then, is that when government spends €1 or $1, €1 in our case, it creates private investment and private consumption in en plus. So there's more money flowing. If the government invests in new highways, then by investing in new highways is giving work to more people who have more purchasing power and can consume more and can invest more, and then you have this rolling over again. So that's what is called the fiscal multiplier or the Keynesian multiplier, and is a very important concept when talking about fiscal policy. Oh, before I go to my crazy chart there, what I was talking about here, right? This, when in an economic recession, consumption goes down, investment goes down, so government spending needs to go up. This is called expansionary fiscal policy. And expansionary fiscal policy has, again, two legs. The government spending one that I was talking about, with the fiscal multiplier that gives you more consumption, more production, and then less unemployment. And that goes back to people having more purchasing power, and that's how you get your economy working again. The other leg of that is pretty close to spending more. It's taxing less. So by taxing less, people have more purchasing power, more consumption, more production, and here we go again. Okay. So that's why we use expansionary fiscal policy in times of crisis, in times of recession, or now we know also in times of pandemics. I want to tell you this, that the expansionary fiscal policy has downsides to it. Not everybody is a Keynesian economist out there, and neoclassical economists, so that's how orthodox economics usually consider that expansionary policy has downsides and creates new risks. Once you start spending more money as a government and reducing taxes, you actually have new issues that emerge. The first one is the most obvious one, is that the public debt rises because of public spending. It's what we've seen in the aftermath of 2008. And it leaves governments at risk of speculative attacks, like what happened on the debt of Greece in the early 2010s. For complicated monetary reasons, prices rise too. It's also a supply and demand thing. So remember, we had our aggregate demand. We were having it go back up with government spending, and that creates inflation. So prices rise and that can be problematic for different reasons. And the last point that I don't really associate with, but that neoclassical economists really think is very important, is that the private sector risks being crowded out by the public sector. I'll just take a minute to explain this crowding out effect. That again, well, let me explain that. It's pretty simple. If you have in your country, you're in a recession, but you have two systems of roads. Some roads are private and have tolls, and some roads are public and are free. if the government starts investing in its public roads and they start getting better and more safe and more easy to use, then people are going to stop using the private roads that have tolls on them because the free ones are better and they work well. So that's going to crowd out the private sector. The private sector is going to lose its market share because of government spending. That's the crowding out effect. Now, the crowding out effect isn't always negative. For instance, in many European countries, the education system is basically crowded out by the government. So free public universities or cheap public universities are the main thing out there, and so it's difficult for the private sector to open universities that you have to pay for, etc., etc. That's not a bad thing. So the crowding out effect always isn't bad, but I just wanted you to know about this. So expansionary policy comes with new risks and new issues, including the rise of public debt, inflation, and this crowding out effect. So when that kicks in, and that's then you hear people calling for contractionary policy, saying that we can't do this forever. We can't keep spending public money like there's no tomorrow, and we need to start contractionary policy. You need to do that so to counter the downsides of expansionary policy or to reduce your debt and build what is called fiscal space, because it's going where you're going to have a new cycle. You're going to have another crisis some other day. So you need the fiscal space. Fiscal space means you don't have too big a debt, so you can start spending more the next time you have a recession. And also, if you have speculative attacks on your debt, that's what happened to Greece, for instance, and your interest rates start going very high, and then it spirals out of control, then you may engage in what is called austerity or contractionary policy. It's exactly the same thing, in order to calm the markets down. Just so we're all clear and everybody knows what austerity is or contractionary policy, there's three ways of doing it, but the idea is to lower government spending. So the government should be spending less compared to the general economy than what it's doing at the moment. So either you have higher taxes and you don't change your spending, so your balance moves, or you do higher taxes and a reduction of spending, or, and that's what is usually done, you go for lower taxes and an important reduction of spending. So you start slashing into public services and you start privatizing and yeah, basically just reducing what the state can do and what governments are doing. Now, this is very controversial and usually politically very difficult to engage in, also because it's not, well, it tends not to be very efficient, although it's been imposed on many countries in the recent decade. But we still have our aggregate demand thing, and so we're getting the government spending down, so our aggregate demand is going to go down again, and we're going to enter into recession again. Okay, so that's the whole business cycle thing. So if we summarize, where we are now, we had an economic recession that was a result of a decrease in aggregate demand, and that always happens in our current economic model. It will happen. It happened in 2008. It happened in 2019, 2020. And so what you do is you have your expansionary fiscal policy to restore consumption, to restore investment, and that leads to economic prosperity. That's the whole idea behind that. But then you have what the neoclassical will call an overheat. So you have the downsides of expansionary policy that create the new risks we were talking about. And so then you go for contractionary fiscal policy, austerity. I mean, if you're Portuguese, Italian, Greek, or Spanish, you know exactly what I'm talking about because it's exactly what happened from 2008 to 2014-15. So you restore the fiscal space and you reduce the role of the government in the economy, and that tends to get you back to recession. So their business cycle starts again. So that's the theory. That's what policymakers have been working with for more or less the past century. But it sounds a bit outdated in a way, because we're facing new challenges. And the fact that most of you, or at least a lot of you, are working on the climate crisis or on housing or on social inequalities does tell us that there's something wrong with this business cycle thing. And that we know that we're going to need to use fiscal policy and use government spending to fight the climate crisis, to have a fair ecological transition, and to reduce inequalities, among which intergenerational inequalities. So let's go there now. What can fiscal policy do to fight the climate crisis? Well, we know that we're going to have to invest in climate action, and climate action is many different kinds of investment, but it's investment in clean energy, it's investment in clean transportation, it's investment in a welfare to support those who are going to be affected most by climate change. So there's going to have to be government spending there. There's two ways of doing it. Either we just spend more on climate action, so that's the quantity of spending, and you'll be hearing us a lot talking about quantity and quality of spending. So the quantity of spending is just spend more with the problems that we saw earlier. And then there's quality of spending. You can redirect some of the investments you usually do, or that you committed to do, towards climate action. And that kind of has an interesting effect, which is you can have even more impact if you, for instance, disinvest fossil fuels and invest in climate action. Then you're killing two birds with one stone. But that's only on the spending part, right? There's also a role to play for taxation. And I just want to say that we've been talking about this with our friends at the Climate Action Network, and these are not official positions of our organizations, but are options that are being considered by policymakers and by NGOs, or that might actually be implemented very soon. And since the idea of this workshop is to give you the tools to understand what's going on in fiscal policy around here, I think it's useful that we actually talk about them. So one of the ideas, and that's actually going to be implemented, is the CBAM, or Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. That's going to be implemented in the EU starting in 2022, I think, and it's going to be gradually implemented towards 2026, if my memories are correct. And the idea there is to say, we're making an effort in Europe to reduce the carbon emissions of what we produce. And that it's the Fit for 55 and everything. Isabel will tell you much more about that. But some products are produced outside of the European Union and then enter the European Union through, I don't know, like the free trade agreements and all the WTO rules that we have. And this adjustment mechanism will tax products entering the European Union based on how much carbon emissions they made in their country of origin, so that there's a level playing field. Everything that's produced in Europe, in the EU, or outside the EU is carbon taxed the same way. Then we could also use taxation inside our own economies. So with what's called carbon adjusted VAT. VAT is the value added tax, is the most common tax on consumption in the European Union. And say, so products would be taxed well, at least part of the taxation on these products could be linked to how much emissions were needed or produced while producing the product. And this could also be accompanied by a just transition fund or exemptions for certain categories of products or people. That there's tons of options there. We just wanted you to hear it here, and so you can ask the questions if you have some. And the last point is that a lot of the subsidies on fossil fuels in the European Union exist in the form of tax cuts. A very famous example is the fuel for planes that has very low tax, and that this is also a way taxation could play a role to help fight the climate crisis and mitigate climate change by removing these tax cuts or reducing them. I want to move on to fiscal policy and intergenerational justice. This is also a teaser for the next capacity building workshop, as we'll be tackling some of the myths that fiscal policy carries with it. So we will be addressing exactly this myth, that public debt is an unfair burden on future generations. There is a case to be made that it is actually the lack of future-oriented investment that is an unfair burden on future generations. Let me develop. This graph is an American one. It's US data, but in Europe it's very, very similar. And it feels when you talk about fiscal policy and of intergenerational justice, when you hear that a debt borrowing now is a burden on future generations, that we're faced between a choice. Either we invest now to fight the climate crisis, to reduce social inequalities, and we get a burden that we're going to have to repay in the future. Or we are going to have to catch up in the near future with the catastrophic impacts of the climate crisis, and that's the choice we have. So the first thing I'd like to say is that debt is actually an interesting way of spreading that burden among generations. If you contract the debt, it's a debt for everyone in the country or everyone on the continent. And the second one is that it only talks about spending and borrowing, and we saw that fiscal policy is also taxation. So who's going to pay the debt is actually a political choice, and making this debt a burden for future generations is a political choice as well. It means you're not asking the wealthiest, you're not asking the older generations to pay for this investment. You're just passing it on to future generations, and there are other options. And yes, I think that's why we wanted to have this week of debate, because we hear a lot that debt is a burden on future generations, and that we shouldn't invest now, and but it's important that the youth, the younger generations, be consulted about this, and that all stakeholders can have their say. So I think I'm done with what fiscal policy is, why it can be useful, and I hope that I've shared both the progressive and the conservative views on this point to help you go through this week of debate with all the tools you need. I'm okay to take questions. I didn't see any appear in the chat, but do so if needed, of course. And remember that word cloud. We're going to switch to Menti right now to see what you considered most important and what you think are the most important concepts for fiscal policy. Wait, I'm almost ready. Here we are. If you can go to menti.com and use that code again, that would be great. I think we can also use this, copy the link that I'm going to put in the chat if you got disconnected from Menti. If I did my job correctly, then you have 3 entries. You don't have to use them all, I think, but it's just if you saw, yes, it's working. Wonderful. Oh, that's interesting. New monetary theory. I don't think we talked about that, but there's some very exciting stuff happening in the monetary field right now. Yes, Keynes, Keynes, and more Keynes. I'm happy that Mr. Keynes is still relevant today. Yes, a lot of things about as well the fact that it's a political choice or an ideological debate. I think it's very interesting to see that. Austerity. Oh, inflation in the middle. That's surprising. Did someone really write eat the rich? I think I'm going to have to moderate that one out. I'm sorry. Okay, let's give us ourselves 30 more seconds and see where we go from there. All right, great. Thank you very much for your input. And Federico, it's time for your screenshot, I think.
All good, thanks.
Wonderful. And I'll go back to our slides and then pass the floor to Isabel for our next part, which is about the EU fiscal framework. The floor is yours, Isabel.
Thank you, Thomas. So hello, everyone. I'm Isabel. I work for Climate Action Network Europe, and I'm happy to be here today with you. So maybe the next slide. Yeah. So with Thomas, we have been discussing what fiscal policy is in general. And now we would like to go into more depth into what we mean with the EU fiscal policy or the EU fiscal framework in particular. So it's a set of rules that member states, in particular Eurozone members, but not only, are supposed to respect. And why are they supposed to respect these rules, these fiscal rules? It's because when one member state faces difficulties to pay back its debt, it could affect the other member states. The Eurozone members, of course, because they share a common currency, but also beyond. And that's what we saw during the Greek crisis back in 2008, 2010. And therefore, there are these fiscal rules, and 2 of them are particularly interesting for us in this debate. And they are called the numerical fiscal rules because they are, in fact, numbers or percentages. And there are 2 big rules. One is that the debt of member states should not exceed 60% of their gross domestic product. And in case it is higher, member states have an obligation to reduce their debt at a certain pace. And the second big rule is that their annual budget deficit should not exceed 3% of their gross domestic product. So you see, they cannot take too many loans because they would increase their debt, and they cannot spend much more than what they have because otherwise it would increase their deficit. So basically, we constrain significantly public spending and public investments by member states with these two rules. Next slide. So where do these rules come from? They are in fact quite old. They are 30 years old, nearly. They come from the Maastricht Treaty, which was adopted in 1992. And we are going to look into details at two articles of the Maastricht Treaty, Article 126 and Article 121. And here I put this picture. It was the heads of states and governments back in December 1991 when they finalized an agreement on the Maastricht Treaty. And I was surprised to see that there were only men, but one lady in the middle who seems to be the Queen of the Netherlands. So I found this a bit funny. So Article 126 says that member states shall avoid excessive government deficits and that the Commission shall monitor the development the macroeconomic situation, let's say, of member states based on two criteria. And these two criteria, one is about the deficit compared to the gross domestic product, which cannot exceed a reference value, but the reference value is not mentioned in the Maastricht Treaty itself. And second is the ratio of the government debt to its gross domestic product, which also cannot exceed a reference value. But again, the reference value is not in the treaty itself. And then there is the next provision 121, which says that member states shall coordinate their economic policies as it is something of common interest. And that's the basis for a series of procedures, which we are going to touch very light touch today, which allow member states to coordinate their macroeconomic policies. And then you are going to ask, so why, where do these 3% and 60% come from? Actually, they are in Protocol 12 to the Maastricht Treaty, which sets these reference values mentioned in the treaty at 3 and 60%. And it's important to bear that in mind, because if there is a revision of these 3 and 60% rules, it means we don't need to amend the Maastricht or the EU founding treaties as such. We just need to amend the Protocol 12. And the procedure is very different because Protocol 12 can be amended with unanimity vote of member states, while revising the EU founding treaties is a very, very cumbersome procedure that takes lots of time, a referenda in a number of member states, approval by all the parliaments, etc. So that's a bit of the history of these two old 30-year-old rules. Next slide. But even if they are old, they have been evolving over time through what is called secondary legislation. So regulation directives, handbooks, guiding documents that have been adopted over time. And I won't enter into the detail on in the green circles. You see some of these main reforms, and these reforms were needed because, in fact, these rules were very hard to respect for many member states, and it was necessary to take into account the national situation. So, in fact, these rules are there, but they are not always completely respected. So there are a lot of exceptions and lots of detailed rules to, I wouldn't say circumvent, but nearly circumvent these 3 and 60% rules. Maybe just one more thing is that what is called the Stability and Growth Pact is in fact two regulations, two EU regulations, which aim at enforcing these debt and deficit limits through what is called the preventive arm and the corrective arm. The preventive arm is when member states, where the support of the European Commission coordinates their macroeconomic policies, and it becomes a corrective arm when there is an excessive deficit. So a member state goes beyond the the 3% rule that we explained. So that's it. And these rules are difficult to respect. So I put a funny image of Mitterrand. I mean, you may be too young to know, but on the left, it's Mitterrand and it's Helmut Kohl trying to hold the Stability and Growth Pact. And Mitterrand tells him, you are going to suffer with your arms because it's too heavy. Next slide. So something new happened, of course, last year, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. And just before the pandemic started in February last year, the European Commission had launched a public consultation on the economic governance review. So basically asking the opinion of you, me, anyone about whether and how to reform this common economic governance system, including the EU fiscal rules. And because COVID appeared, this public consultation was suspended because it appeared that there were more urgent things to do at the time than to proceed with the reform of the EU fiscal rules and economic governance. Next slide. And among the more urgent things to do, one of them was to suspend the 3% and 60% rules that I just told you about, because the member states and the Commission felt that countries needed more fiscal space, as Thomas explained, to support their economy, to support people suffering from the pandemic, to invest more in public health. So they decided to activate what is called the general escape clause, which is a clause which is part of the EU legal framework and allows, in case of exceptional circumstances that threaten the whole union, to suspend the 3% and 60% rules. So the escape clause has been activated in March 2020, so quite early, allowing member states to invest and spend what they needed to respond to the pandemic. And it will be suspended until the end of next year. But normally, it should be back to normal from January 2023, which means that then member states will have to relatively quickly respect again the 3% and 60% rules, which may translate into austerity. Next slide. So not only was the general escape clause activated, but also the EU adopted the Recovery and Resilience Facility. So what is this? It is a big loan that the EU took in order to provide grants and loans to member states to allow them to respond to the pandemic. And this was a big thing because it's the very first time that the EU as such took a loan on the capital markets. And that, of course, allowed to have a low interest rate for this loan because it's the EU as a whole, while some member states
Isabel, you're muted. Isabel, you're...
sorry, I lost the microphone. I don't know why.
Voila.
So I don't know what you lost, but it's the first time that the EU as such has been taking a loan, and it allows to give grants and loans to member states to do the twin transitions, so the green transition, investing in climate action, and the digital transition. And there is even a target of 37% of the spending by member states with this money needs to be for climate action and the green transition. So that was also an answer from the EU that allowed to open fiscal space, to give more fiscal financial means to member states to respond to COVID. Next slide. And then later on, that was this year in July, the European Commission launched what is called the Fit for 55 package. It's a series of legislative proposals covering, you see, many different fields: industry, transport, buildings, energy, with the objective to increase climate ambitions. Because in December last year, the EU, and member states as a whole, they decided to increase their climate ambitions and to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by 2030. So that's why it's Fit for 55. That required then a series of legislative changes in order to effectively achieve this 55% emission reductions target. So there's more ambitious climate objectives. Next slide. So in Europe, we are not happy. I mean, we are happy, but not happy because 55% is not enough if we really want global warming to remain below 1.5 Celsius. And we consider that it should be at least 65% emission reductions. Next slide. But even with 55% emission reduction target, you can see on the graph on the left that we will need massive investments, public and private, in order to make this happen, in order to be able to invest what we need in transport, in energy, in reforms, in the circular economy, etc. And you can see in green and in gray is what are the investments, the additional investments needed to meet this 55% greenhouse gas emissions reduction target compared to what is being invested at the moment. And this doesn't even cover all the sectors. So the needs are massive, and therefore we will need fiscal space. Of course, we could rob Peter to pay Paul, which means that we could use existing budget to invest more in climate, but that means that we would take from other important spending, including social spending, which is certainly not something we want. So basically, the only way to create this fiscal space to be able to invest more is to increase taxation, which may be part of the solution, including setting up environmental taxes, for example, but also for governments to take loans, which means that it will increase their deficit and their debt, inevitably. Next slide. Inevitably, but the problem is that if you see the green line in the middle, it's the 60% debt to GDP ratio that member states are supposed to abide by, so to respect. And the purple line for each member state is where they were standing before COVID, and the blue line is where they were standing by the end of last year. So you see that in all member states, without exception, the debt has been increasing post-COVID. Obviously, countries had to spend more to respond to the crisis, support their people, support their economy. But that means that reaching this green line, if from 1st January 2023, we need to get back to the green line, it's impossible, or it means cutting so much public spending that we go right away into austerity and we will never have the money we need for the green transition that we just spoke about. Next slide. Just before I end, I wanted to look back a little bit at what happened after the 2008 crisis, because a big argument for this, for reforming the current EU fiscal framework, is that it has created so much damage after the 2008 financial crisis and the Eurozone crisis at the time. And here you can see in this graph the GDP in blue. So whether or not we believe that the gross domestic product is an objective, a valid objective per se. In any case, it measures the productivity of the economy, so it still means something here. And you can see that the GDP after 2008 went down, and then it went up again from 2009. But then you have the investments in red, and you see that the investments after the crisis have gone down a lot. And have only gone up very slightly, but because of the EU fiscal rules, when there was the Eurozone debt crisis, the GDP was starting to go up, but the investments were going down. You see that between 2011 and 2013. So it really shows that these rules constrain member state spending, even if the GDP, the economy starts going better. These rules really have a chilling effect on member states' public investments. Next slide. And in this slide, you can see the euro area net public investments. So this time it doesn't include the private investments, it's only the public investments. And you can see that they went down, as I was saying before, but you can also see that the pace through which they went up remained quite slow and much below the United States, for example, which is in green, which means that because of these EU fiscal framework, these rules, the public investments has continued to remain largely insufficient in terms of the needs for social justice and climate action, even in 2019, just before the pandemic. Next slide. I believe I'm done with what I wanted to share with you, and indeed it's really the moment to ask questions, and there are no silly questions. This workshop is really meant for sharing the basics. Maybe we won't be able to answer all your questions, but that's another story. So feel free to raise your hand. And I hand over to you, maybe Jan, for the moderation in case there are questions.
Sure, thank you, Isabel. Happy to do that.
I believe you're on mute, Jan.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Okay, I think you can either raise your hand like Nicholas just did, or if you feel uncomfortable, turn your camera on and ask the question. Just post it in the chat and I'll read it out. So first question, over to you, Nicholas.
Hi, this is Nicholas from NAVO, Germany. I was wondering, you showed a slide on what is actually needed as terms of investment for climate action. Is there a total number on it? Yes, this now the next one on the left, yeah. So the green and the gray area, I suppose, together.
Oh, yes, I can answer directly. Maybe there are numbers indeed. I don't know them by heart, but I can share them with you. But these numbers are not. Well, I mean, some say that they are somehow overestimated, others say that they are underestimated. So it's just numbers, but it gives an idea of what is needed for part of the transition. Because, for example, the circular economy is not there, so it covers transport and energy, mostly, these assessments from the Commission.
Thanks, Isabel. Anyone else who has a question? I don't see anyone, which I think means that Thomas and Isabel were very clear. But yeah, just to repeat what Isabel said, there are no stupid questions, so please feel free to ask. I see Inge has a question. Go ahead, please.
Thanks. So I was wondering, with the Frugal Four, who, and I guess a few other member states who just sent a letter saying no, we should go back to the previous rules. What are their arguments? Why are they saying that we should do that?
Thanks, Inge. Thomas, I see your hand, so go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Inge, for that question. I think what their arguments are and have been, although we'd be very happy to hear them during the week of debate as well, to see how they actualized this argumentation. And there's actually an event specifically on the vision of the Frugal Four that can be very interesting to attend to. But I think what their arguments are basically the downturns of expansionary policy that we were talking about earlier. So the risk on public debt is one of their biggest fears, that we might happen to be in a situation similar to that of of the beginning of the 2010s with unsustainable debt levels and speculative attacks on one debt that actually attack the currency as well because of monetary mechanisms behind that. And then that's the economics of it, and there's also a moral aspect to it when you listen to what the Frugal Four say, that there is a discrepancy between the north and the south of Europe in the way that public money is being managed. And if we're going for common debt and common loans, then it's important that this discrepancy would be reduced, so that it's not we take loans together and we spend everything on only southern countries. That's also something that they say, and that's also a myth that we'll be working on in the myth capacity building workshop too. I hope I made myself the voice of the frugals well.
Thanks, Thomas, and thanks, Inge. Very good question. I mean, just for those who don't know who the Frugal Four are, it's for fiscally conservative countries, so Austria, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Sweden, and there are a few other countries joining them in arguing for what Thomas just said. Okay, I think we have time for 2 or 3 more questions. So anyone? Go ahead, Mathieu.
Yeah, good afternoon. I'm Mathieu from Switzerland. I have a question regarding the fiscal systems in Europe. It seems to me that each country has a different fiscal system, which makes it difficult for the European Union to lead, to follow a straight line and to have a common objective. And just wanted to have your opinion on that. Do you think there is a chance that in the coming, I don't know, 5 to 10 years, there is something more common regarding fiscal policy in the European Union?
Thomas, would you like to start, or shall I start and you complete?
Let's do that.
Okay. I mean, I spoke about this a big loan that the EU has been taking called Next Generation EU, funding the recovery and resilience plans of member states. And there are a certain number of criteria which are not good enough, but I mean it is nevertheless a good start to determine what is green investment, since there is this target I told you of 37% of the funds need to go for the green transition. So there are a number of criteria which we want to improve, etc. But it is a starting point, and you know we could imagine. I mean, some groups are working on greening national budgets, and there is also work to green the EU budget by having maybe some of these criteria could become common among member states. And if we go towards the reforms of the EU fiscal framework, whereby green investments would not count towards the deficit rule, for example, it means member states will have to have a common understanding of what is a green investment in their national budgets. So I'm not sure we'll go towards something completely harmonized in all accounts in terms of national fiscal systems and national fiscal policies, and that may not even be desirable. But in terms of what is green, maybe we could imagine that there could be more and more conversions towards that, especially if a fiscal framework reform goes towards encouraging green investments. It means they need to agree what is green investment.
Thanks, Isabel. If I may just add one point, it's that actually 2 points. Sorry, it's that the fact that there are all these different fiscal systems, one per member state or even more for federal member states, has led the Commission to be very control and surveillance based historically. So that was, you know, the preventive arm and corrective arm of the Stability and Growth Pact. And it seems that this is changing a bit from a very top-down vision to a more of bottom-up one, and that we're with the Recovery and Resilience Facility talks and discussions that have happened in order to like build the actual national recovery plans. The Commission more, and that's what Pavlina Chernova, I think, or yes, was saying in the opening event of this week, have a more bottom-up vision and enables fiscal policy to be built in a European way. So that might be a way of convergence too. And just a rapid point on taxation. I think that one of the biggest what a situation in which Europe has not harmonized much is the tax systems. Although it does have a common framework for a value-added tax, it also has a very important vulnerability to tax dumping, and we've been seeing that increasingly, and we'll see where that goes. I know that you know, I don't know if you've heard of what the OECD is trying to push for, at least a common minimum tax for income, society, companies' income. I'm gonna manage to do that. And that's a good start, I think, and we'll see if the EU wants to do more about this.
Thanks, Thomas. I think we can quickly take one last question, Anya.
Hi, I'm not sure if you can hear me. Cool. So I wanted to know if you could go back to the slide on contractionary policy, if possible. Thanks. The reason I asked that is because I wanted to know if you could explain more what speculative attacks means and what are the actual consequences or dangers that we could expect of high national debt for currencies that we know are key to global economic markets, such as the EU and the US. And if you could find a way to more logically link those dangers with the three options that are written here of higher taxes or lower taxes. So like why would these adjustments actually respond to those dangers? I'm missing a bit of a clear quantitative link for me, if you could explain that more clearly.
Okay, that's quite a challenge. I'll do my best. Thanks for the question, actually, because I think it's really important. When we look at what happened in Greece, I think it's maybe the easiest example here is countries issue debt on markets, and the market fixes more. It's more the market that fixes the interest rate than the state, right? It's when Greece wants to borrow €1 million, it goes to the financial markets, and it finds the best bidder and the one that's going to give them the lowest rate, and the investors who are lending the money will give you a higher rate if they think that there's a risk that you're not going to pay the rent back. So the higher the risk of you defaulting or of your country not being able to repay this debt, the higher the interest rate you're going to pay. So that's the basics behind interest rates. What happens when a country has unsustainable debt, or when the debt gets too high, is that investors may start refusing to lend to this country, or refusing to lend at the rates that were the rates that you were paying before. I'm trying this. So what happens in these cases is you have debt that's, I don't know, 10 years old, 20 years old, 30 years old that you have to pay. And what countries usually do is that they roll that debt over. So they take new debt to pay the ancient debt, and then they just continue doing that again and again. But it means that at a moment when investors, and that's what we call a speculative attack, is investors will say, okay, we don't believe that Greece can pay their debt anymore. So you're not going to be paying 3% interest or 5% interest, but 10 or 15 or 20. And this makes the service of debt bigger and bigger, and it spirals out of control in a way, because you need to borrow to actually pay the interest, and borrow and borrow again. And so your debt gets bigger and it's every more expensive. And that's what happens. That's what happened with Greece, for instance. So, and would that answer your question? That's what a speculative attack is. But then I think the monetary policy of this is a bit complicated for this workshop, or at least it would need a bit more time. I can come back to you on this specific point, because then we'd have to go into the reserves of the central bank and how money is created and all that. And I don't think we want to go there right now, if that's okay.
Sure, thanks. No, that explains very well. I appreciate it. And then the other part of my question was just, you have these 3 bullet points. You have higher taxes and steady spending, and then lower taxes and important reduction of spending. And those are completely different things. So yes. I wanted to understand how these are considered responses to those issues.
I forgot.
Thank you.
To
yeah,
answer that
it's a long
part.
question.
So if we just go for a bullet point after bullet point. So you're under speculative attack. Investors think that you cannot pay your debt back. So what you do is you have higher taxes and you don't touch your spending. But by getting higher taxes, you have more money coming in. So you're reassuring in the fact that you're going to be able to pay your debt. Or you can do the 2 arms, higher taxes and less spending. So you have more money to pay investors back. Or the last one, and that's the one that we usually go for, because higher taxes and reduction of spending really depresses the economy, is that you lower the taxes on production, for instance, but then you slash into all your public services in order to get the money that you need to pay the investors back. And that usually stops, well, it's supposed to stop a speculative attack on your debt.
Thanks, Thomas, and thanks, Anya, for the question. Maybe a good moment to mention that this is the first of 3 capacity building workshops, so there'll be plenty of room to ask questions in the other ones. So we're going to move on to the last part, and I believe that's Federico with the Jamboard.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Jan. As you can see, we thought it would be good to have some 10 minutes at the end to kind of hear your thoughts and discuss a bit what your thoughts on what has been said so far and this first workshop. That's the reason why we created this Jamboard. You can find the link in the chat, and I will start sharing my screen in a second so that we also can all see it there. Yeah, does this work?
Yes.
Yep, great. Because I don't see any Zoom anymore. So please speak up if you have any questions. Right. So actually, what you see here on the screen is the result of the first Menti that we did this morning. I mean, at 3. It basically has all the keywords that you inputted in that Menti regarding, what you're active in. And so we've discussed fiscal policy, we've discussed fiscal policy in the EU, and now the question is really, hopefully these 2 sessions have given you a bit of a clear idea of how fiscal policy works and the basics and gist of it. And so the question really open for discussion for all of you is, how do we link all these themes, all these topics with fiscal policy. How do we link climate justice with fiscal policy in an effective way? What does sustainable transport have to do with fiscal policy? How that can jump into the discussion. And so really this Jamboard is for everyone to use. You can find a little post-its here at the left, on the left of the Jamboard. You just click on a post-it and you write your thoughts. I can show you. There you go. And then you just add your thought and add it to the Jamboard. I have divided it into two different sessions, so to say. Two different. What I mean is that it would be interesting to see a bit what you think the needs and challenges are at this stage. Meaning, what are the challenges that you see in linking what you're working on with fiscal policy, where there is a need for, I don't know, further explanations, further research that can link these activities to fiscal policy. I don't know if any of you want to add something at this point. Don't be shy. I see someone clicked on the post-it. I see some post-its moving, but nothing, no inputs so far. Or if you don't want to write in the post-it, you can as well just turn on your mic in Zoom and share your thoughts. I see a first one. Explaining civil society organization colleagues that fiscal policy is important. Ultimately, there's always the question, who's going to pay for it, right? And so this would be a challenge, but as well, I would say a need, right? Because there is, the challenge is to answer that question, and the need is to then work more towards that. Let's see if someone else has inputs. I don't see many, so maybe let's, since we don't have much time left, let's just directly skip towards slide 4. I hope you can see it now. You can find it here. Jamboard is, there you go, number 4. Yeah, I see some people moving there slowly. Great. Some people have moved too far behind. Yeah, it seems there's a reasonable amount. Great, thanks. And again, this is perhaps a different question. We're all working on different things. Several of us working on climate and youth and youth movements. What can we do collectively first to make fiscal policy better for us, and how, in a way, I would say, to make it matter more, right? What do you think we should do? I mean, or at least there is plenty of things to do, but what the priorities should be? Do you think there should be more focus on research? And if that's the case, on what kind of research? Should civil society be more active and then mobilize? And if that's the case, in which way? Dialogue with institutions, to what extent and to which institutions? Should civil society make alliances with other stakeholders in the fiscal policy debate? And if that's the case, with whom? Or if you have any other ideas, just put your post-its on the, next to the question mark. I see some of you have. I say more for our discussion, so having more places where this can be discussed. Training member organizations on fiscal policy. I see where this might come from, and I see post-its moving. That's great. Let me create a few more if you want to complement. I also see explaining and promoting the idea of sustainable finance. So towards in between, I would say research and mobilization right there. More weeks of debates. So that's also an opportunity to dialogue with institutions and see and hear what they have to say. That's great. Let's see another one. Find a way to show that the public how EU money matters for their lives. So encourage mobilization for higher corporate and high income taxes to fund the transition. Okay, so this is in between really mobilization and alliances. Oh, I see money moving, so I'll create a few more. And if you agree with some of these post-its, you have these little squares here. Just feel free to grab one and bring it closer to your post-it, or I mean the post-it you like. I also see explain what EU fiscal policy is about. So maybe what you did, but maybe scaling it up to a larger extent. I'm not sure who inputted the comment, but again, feel free to also intervene and speak on via the Zoom if you want to comment on any of this. I see the squares are having some success. That's great. Joint fiscal matters. Yes. Not a valid point. Focus on lobbying ministries for finance of member states. Indeed. Do you have any ideas on how that could be done, possibly? And I also see another one, bring people together to reimagine the economic system. That's a very nice one as well. I'll add my little square there as well. I see someone joined. There's a few that joined. That's great. Let's have one more minute if anyone wants to comment or add squares or add post-its. People in academia together, yes. So research and maybe align with the academia more and trying to find bridges between research and the people. That's great. Yeah. Thanks everyone for the inputs. You can keep on adding things to this Jamboard for another few minutes. And in the meantime, I will pass it back to Jan for some concluding remarks. Thanks everyone for participating to this, and yeah, keep on inputting if you want.
Thanks, Federico. So yeah, we've come to the end of this event. So thanks everyone for joining. Thanks for your active participation. I've been watching the participant numbers a bit over the course of the event, and we're almost where we started, with sort of a peak in the middle. So there were more and more people joining, which I think means maybe two things. The first one is that our workshop hosts, Thomas, Federico, and Isabel, I think have done a really, really great job in explaining a very complex topic in simple terms. So thanks to all of you, really great work. And the second is that, you know, a lot of you are interested in the topic and would like to contribute further to this or know more about this. And there's a few things you can do if you want to get involved. Now, the first thing is that we are actually part of a coalition, so that is both the European Youth Forum and the Climate Action Network, called Fiscal Matters. So that's the coalition behind the Week of Debate. That's why the website is called Fiscal Matters. And we also have a mailing list with, I believe, a bit more than 120 people on it now. Don't worry, it's not too busy, but it's used to share important information, to organize, to support each other. So if you're interested in maybe working for a civil society organization or you're an activist to get more involved in the topic, this would be a good place to connect. And we also have monthly calls where we have updates. And if you just click on the link I provided in the chat, so there is a Google form where you can sign up for the mailing list. Now, the second thing is that you can, and that's very much appreciated, if you would post on social media any thoughts you have after the workshop using the hashtag Fiscal Matters. And then, as I said in the beginning, this is only the start of the workshop series. So we'll have another one on Wednesday, the same time, I believe, at 3. Maybe I can just quickly also post the link to the registration if you haven't registered already. So this will be the second part of the capacity building workshop. And then there's a third one on Thursday. So in this second one, and Thomas already introduced that, we'll talk a little bit more about all the myths that exist about fiscal policy. So yeah, hoping to see you there. That's it from our side. Thanks again for joining, and thanks to the speakers. Have a good day and hope to see you in the other 2 capacity building workshops.
Thanks a lot. Bye.